Okay, in this lesson we're going to talk about using color intensity. How strong do we need to make the color in our painting, or how muted we're going to make it and why. And when we talk about that, that's predicated on the idea that we're not copying exactly what we see. We want to decide how strong to make the color or how gray based on suggesting the light in our scene or in the photograph. So whether it's cloudy day, indirect light, or direct sunlight, or shadow on a sunny day, we're using intense color or strong color to suggest the light. Or we're using it to pull the viewer's eye around the painting, direct their attention. We can make something less important by graying the color or making it more muted, or make something more important by making the color real strong. That's why it's not real effective to use all real intense color, because then nothing stands out. All the colors are just screaming at you. It's only when you select certain areas to be stronger, certain areas to be muted, that it becomes effective. Same thing with everything being all gray. There's really no effective use there either of intensity, because everything's gray. But if I have a combination of keeping everything slightly muted and picking one area where I'm going to have more intense colors, it's going to work better. So this also gets us away from just copying photograph, or even if we're painting from life, just copying what we see from life. It gets us away from that idea. If I just replicate what's in front of me, it's going to work. Because that keeps us from thinking in terms of, okay, what's the best color or value or intensity to suggest the light that I see. It gets us away from trying to suggest what's there. We just end up trying to copy, and that really is a bad habit with photographs, and we all get into that, just copying the photograph. It's kind of our default mechanism. If we're struggling, we just go back to copying. And what we're saying there is, well, if I just can reproduce the photograph, at least it'll work on that level. That's never a very good level to work at. So thinking of the color wheel, when I think of making my colors more intense or grayer, the idea that every time I mix a color, I'm going to make it a color from the color wheel. So if I look at the photograph here, I see this. And again, color's a choice. So it's not like there's only one choice when I look at this, like this barn. I'm going to see this green here as a yellow green, and then the shadow is a blue green. So that's my choice of color. If I want to make it look more cloudy day, I would make it just a light green and a dark green. But the minute I choose yellow green in the sunlight, I'm choosing to make it more sunlit, intensify. Same thing with the tree, darker, slightly more muted yellow green than the barn. And then for the shadow on the tree, really dark, bluish green, and muted because it's in the shadow. And I see that the hill here and the flat plane are too much the same value and color. So I would want to mute the hill to push it back a little more, make it slightly cooler. And I see this as an orange, yellow-orange maybe. So a muted yellow-orange, blue-violet, and yellow-orange to get that muted color. And then just a slightly muted or more intense yellow-orange for the flat plane. It's catching more light because it's flat. So it's decisions we're making on the color as well as how intense we're going to make it. So let's go with that field and mountain. Let's say they're yellow-orange. The complement of yellow-orange, of course, is blue-violet. And thinking in terms of the colors on our palette, the blue-violet is ultramarine blue and alizarin crimson. A little bit of crimson, not much. Blue is going to dominate, but it's going to be a blue-violet, not a blue. Colors on this color wheel aren't great. I should really mix it over. This is verging more on yellow-green than just green. And this doesn't look much like yellow-green. Looks more like just a dark yellow. But anyway, so picking a color from the color wheel and then using the complement to mute it. And I tend to make all my paintings at least slightly muted. So even the strongest yellow-orange in a painting that I want is going to have at least a tiny bit of blue-violet. Now, I don't necessarily have to use the exact complement. If I don't need to gray it a lot, I might just use violet for yellow-orange. It'll mute it, but it won't get it as gray. With the blue, I have to be careful because that might turn the yellow-orange kind of green, depending on how yellow the yellow-orange is. And all this goes to understanding the color wheel better. And that basically means understanding your palette better, colors on your palette. Because all the colors on the color wheel here, or some color on my palette or combination of colors. So the more I understand this, the easier it is to think in terms of how to mix what I want. So it's a good idea to do some exercises on developing how to gradually mute a color, or how much you need of the complement to make something a lot grayer. And what I do is, they're not charts, but I'll just get a canvas board like a 12 by 16, and I'll just squeeze out or mix a pile. Let's just pick another color here. Let's say orange and blue. I can have orange up here and blue down here, and just fill in a circle of each. Then somewhere in the middle of the canvas, I'm going to have the gray pile. And I might start there. I might get some orange and blue and mix them till I get a gray. Of course, it takes some white to get a gray. I probably add a little bit of white to all these mixtures, only because the blue is so dark. Sometimes you can't see the color change when something's that dark. So a little bit of white. But it would probably take a little more orange. Let's say that's orange and this is blue. A little more orange than blue to make a gray, because the blue is so dark. But I would mix a flat gray. Again, take some white so you can see the gray. Without white, it doesn't really look that gray. But then I want orange with just a tiny bit of blue here, because I want close to a straight orange but slightly muted. And then I'd probably mix 3 piles. You can do 4, you can do 5, but 3 is good. Just slightly muted, a little more muted, a little grayer, and then gray. Then the same thing with the blue. Blue with just a tiny bit of orange, blue with just a little bit more, getting grayer, a lot grayer, and then gray. And all that does is just help you develop a touch for it, of how much color to add to get something grayer. And I'll usually do the whole color wheel like that. Mix the colors and put them up here, and then the complements down here, and gradually mix towards gray. It's not an earth-shaking, eye-opening exercise, but it just gives you the feel of how much it takes sometimes to make a color more muted. And it takes a little bit of white in each mixture again, so you can see the value in the color a little bit better. We didn't have to do this in art school. All we had to do was color charts. 12 color charts, 144 squares in each one, so whatever that was. It gave us a good idea of combination mixtures, then adding white. It had nothing to do with grain. This is strictly on mixing intense colors and gray colors. So it's kind of a good exercise. It really helps you kind of see what you can do. And then have that around. Stick it up in the studio. It gives you a feel for the muted colors. You'll also see how really nice the middle color and the 2 colors closest to the middle on either side are. Because if you take a color and just slightly mute it, it has a lot more harmony to it, as opposed to the real strong straight colors of straight orange, straight red, straight blue. And it just reminds you of how slightly muted colors work a lot better in nature than straight colors. So that being said, let's look at some images. And this is a photograph in California in Eaton Canyon. If you want to have a good place to paint near Pasadena or LA, Eaton Canyon is pretty nice. When I'm out photographing, it's usually early morning, late afternoon. And this is late afternoon because more shadows. It's pretty dead and flat, midday. But when I'm looking at this, there's nothing real strong color-wise. These are fairly gray, but I see this as an orange. I see this as a blue-violet with some orange in it, because if there's orange in the sunlit area of the rock, there's going to be some orange in the shadow as well. But the cooler color will dominate in the shadow, and the warmer color will dominate in the sunlight. But everything is fairly muted. If I were just to copy this, it would be fairly muted. So I need to decide where are my stronger colors going to be. And first off, let's just look compositionally. It's way too big. If my focal point is in this area, I want to get rid of some of the surrounding stuff. I really like the backdrop of the shadow and sunlight on the hills. It's more about the hills and the shadow than it is anything else. But I can at least get rid of a lot of the surrounding area just to zoom in more. And that pulls me into more of a focal point area. But the first thing I want to do is, if this tree is closer to the center of interest, I want to push the color on that. And just choosing a color. This is more of a yellow-green, but it's not a straight yellow-green. If I were to mix, my strongest yellow-green would be Viridian or Cerulean with cad yellow. That's straight cad yellow. Of course, this is computerized, but it would be the same with oil paint. So you can see I've taken this cad yellow, and let's just say I used Cerulean to come up with a yellow-green, and then added the complement to it. So the complement of yellow-green would be alizarin crimson. And that's basically what I did to this yellow-green right in here, was add alizarin crimson to it. So you can see the difference. It really knocked it down, but it's still the strongest color by far. So it tells you how gray this photographic color is around here. It is very, very gray. If we're too used to just copying what we see, we're going to always end up with a very gray painting. We might get the value right, and that'll suggest light to some degree, but playing more with the intensity. Then, well, I didn't take much, go in stages much here, but I intensified the colors around it a little bit more. This is still probably the strongest, this yellow-green, but this is probably same color right here. I just added orange to it, to this yellow-green with a bit of alizarin in it. Just added orange to it. So it became kind of a red-orange and yellow-green. And that changes the color slightly, a little more muted, but still more intense than the photograph. This is a fairly strong yellow-green, a little darker than this. So I'm also comparing value. And then I take that same yellow-green, add violet to it, I add some Viridian to it. It's a little stronger down there. But I'm keeping this yellow-green the strongest. And then the real light white trunk will pull the eye to it, as well as these lines at the bottom. These lines are really pulling the viewer's eye in there. So I'm taking just that straight line across the shadow, which I think just cuts off the bottom, and put it more at an angle instead of straight. And that really goes a long way to pull the viewer's eye in. But then also the intensity of the grass. I can get that grass less intense by the time I get to the edges. I don't think I did that there, but I would want this to be a little bit stronger. Same thing with the greens here. A little bit more intense than the photograph. And then I would gradually make it slightly more muted. And that varies the intensity a bit. You know, all this is real strong sunlit areas here. But if I just gradually add a little bit of the complement more as it goes to the edge, it makes this area stand out just a bit more. And keep this a little stronger than that, then I'm really directing the viewer's eye where I want, and not where, you know, the camera necessarily, or what the camera necessarily did. Also increase the intensity of the shadow. It's still muted, really muted compared to the green tree, but compared to the photograph's very, very gray-green. And I don't want that. There's a lot of green in there. But it's not even a bluish green. It's cooler than the sunlight, only because it doesn't have that strong yellow-orange in it. But it's not a color that works shadow-wise. So this, to me, would be a muted blue to blue-violet. So blue with a little orange, or blue-violet with a little orange or yellow-orange. So keeping that intensity where I want it. And you can see this, to me, I would call this a light orange. Or I could say light yellow-orange. It doesn't really matter. But let's go to a light orange on the... And that's a light... I could probably get a bit lighter. That's also grayer. And that's pretty close to what's there. So orange would work there. This doesn't have an intensity that is same value. But I could use straight cad orange. And this is light enough that it doesn't need much complement. So when you get to real light colors, like the rocks here, or the rocks down in here, you don't need to add much complement because the white does the job. It kills it. Now, I probably still would add a touch of violet or blue violet to it. Not much, unless I really wanted to gray it and or cool it. But I want to keep it warm. The white will make the color very muted, but still looks sunlit enough. So add the white first, test it, and if it's still too strong, you can add a little bit of complement, but that white really knocks that down. And this one also, I like this image, but again, very flat. It's midday. So first thing I want to do is zoom in more on the focal point. And although the barn is kind of the focal point, what interested me was the hills. Really like the hills in here. So although I'm going to crop it some, keep the barn out of center, I want the hills more than anything else. And here also I would make that barn more of a stronger yellow-green. Now I could have it slightly muted because it's an old barn, but it's still going to be intense. So that yellow-green, and this is yellow and viridian. It's not yellow and ultramarine blue. Yellow and ultramarine blue would be slightly muted anyway, because ultramarine blue has red in it. So that you start off with a more muted green, even though it'll look real sunlit. It's kind of like the comparison of this yellow-green here on the tree and this yellow-green on the barn. You can see how different they are. Of course, they're different in value, but this is more muted because it would be mixed with ultramarine blue and cad yellow. This would be mixed with cerulean and yellow or viridian and yellow. Still muted. Again, the yellow-green would be the alizarin crimson, and that would knock it down, but it wouldn't be very muted. It would still be fairly intense. Then also the idea of the hills here. I've darkened all the hills just with a muted violet, a little bit of yellow. And then I have a violet and yellow a little lighter up here and violet and yellow a little darker. And I would probably push the intensity of the cooler color a little bit more so it stays back. So more muted, maybe slightly cooler, which the complement's violet, so that's going to cool it as well as muted. And then down below, same color, yellow, orange, or orange, with just a tiny bit of blue violet or blue or violet. Not much. Because again, the white is going to knock that down, so I don't need much complement. But you can see my intensity here. Strongest color is the barn, then the lights on the trees, and then these a little bit more muted also. And I can vary the color too. This is in August, so everything's green, but I want a variety of green, which I'm getting when I do these two. I might even take this tree, which is slightly different, and make it a bit more of a kind of a warm green to blue-green, and then this one in more of an orange-green or purple-green to get that just some variation of green. But that works better than just trying to copy exactly what I see. So the intensity is really strong on all the colors here, and as you move out, it's going to get grayer. And of the colors in here, I have the barn more intense than the greens. This one is also in California, in Santa Barbara. Real strong light here, and you can see right away this is your intense color. Shadows are grayer, a lot of grayer stuff. Still, I wanted to determine how I'm going to set up that more gray, which colors are grayer and which colors are more muted. I think in this case, everything's backlit, so finding the shadow pattern, which is easier when things are backlit to find the shadow pattern. Everything vertical, shrubbery, trees, the cast shadows, which aren't vertical, but cast shadows. And that sets up just the sunlight and shadow. And making the background stay back. Real important, because this goes flat. There's no depth in there at all. So getting that real flat. Another thing is getting rid of what's not important. And what's not important is the trees over here on the right. None of that stuff. There's interesting dark and light shapes, but it doesn't do anything for the focal point, which is around the steps and part of the tree. Some of the background, that's what I would get rid of. So I got the shadow pattern set up, and it's not that you have to be exact with every tiny little shape, but be exact with the big shape of the shadow pattern. Really think about the edge here as it goes in and out. Same thing in this tree. Be careful with the big shape. You don't have to paint around little shapes. Do tiny little patterns. You can see my shadow pattern starting down here on the road goes up and around. It all connects. It all stays connected in there. That's what you want the shadow pattern to do. And do that on the thumbnail, but establishing that first, then coming back and establishing where the more intense colors are going to be. And first thing I would want to do is knock down the colors on the left here. So you can see I want the focal point to be here. I turn this little hillside, there's some wildflowers in there, and I can push that as much as I want. So making those wildflowers a little bigger, maybe adding some more of these yellow, real light yellow wildflowers in there. But I do want to knock this down, if not even get rid of it. So let's do this. Let's just get rid of it this way. Make it more shadow on the gravel. And I don't mind some of the light green, but if I put that light green in there, it has to be really muted. So if I go to a yellow green, ultramarine blue, and a little bit of cad yellow or ochre even, which would be even more muted. But even here, the intensity is a little stronger because of the value. I've got strong value contrast, so that still draws your eye quite a bit. So I would put that in shadow. And this is what you work out in a small value painting or even a small little color study. Work out that idea of the intensity of the color, what areas are going to be stronger. If I want to get some reddish color in there, I would just put it in shadow. So I don't mind carrying some of that red around in shadow on the left side. So now this stands out not only because of contrast, but because of intensity of color. And the shadow here on the trees is more muted, obviously, too. Then a little bit of light within the shadow. Oh, my thing came back here. I didn't put it on the last layer. So ignore these bright colors, but these kind of lighter shadow colors. Now, there is some intensity in the shadow. I don't want a really dark gray green. It'll be a definite blue-green and green, and some gray, but some a little bit of color to it. So be careful, just because it's in shadow and it's going to be more muted than the sunlit areas, that you don't get it too gray. Have some intensity. And I will kind of go middle of the road on both the sunlit areas and the shadow areas for intensity, because I can always come back and punch it a bit stronger or make it a bit grayer right on the canvas. Unless I know I want this to be real strong, then I'll try and punch it in there. But if my value is right, like in these sunlit areas, and I have the temperature right, it's warm, right value, then I can always alter the color slightly. So don't think that every color has to be perfect. Just get something down there and then adjust it.